The first thing to look at is the data. More than 70% of the global population, and even more so of Western cultures, are lonely, unsatisfied, disconnected from themselves and other people. Now, the response, the call to community, is a common one. It's an instinctual desire to create a sense of home. Now, every energy, every feeling has a particle or a recipe or a pattern, and it has the energy that emerges out of that pattern. In other words, there is no resonance without a structure, and there's no structure that doesn't have a resonance. But one of the issues with a psychologically illiterate culture is that people want the feeling, but don't want the structure that creates the feeling, and often in an adolescent state rebel against structure, and in a psychologically illiterate state do not know how to design the structure that creates the feeling that they want. Now, that's coupled with traumatic illiteracy. In a highly traumatized culture, everyone has a history of trauma. And at the root of all trauma is a memory of being helpless, of being in overwhelming pain, shock, and terror of that pain and shock, and nobody responding, nobody understanding. Oftentimes, the very caregivers, the parents, the older siblings, the priest, whatever, is responsible for that trauma, is forcing it from the position of a giant to a small child. And the consequence of that abuse and trauma is so severe that it often pivots the highest deity within the psyche from being one of growing and becoming all that we can be to one of fear. And the fear is of traumatic reenactment. And the bottom line that forms out of that goes something like this: I never want to give someone else the power. I never want to feel that way again. What do I have to do and not do to never feel that way again? Well, one of the things is to separate and not give anyone any leverage. I'm not going to be alone with you. I'm not going to get too close to you. I'm not going to give you impact. I'm not going to give you power. I'm going to keep my distance. Well, the other thing that often hardens is a simplistic, carefully curated, narrow identity that is safe in its familiarity. So what are we doing in community? We're upsetting identity, meaning we're deliberately restructuring the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And number two, if we create a cult or culture, meaning all cultures are cults, there's the cult of how you doing, I'm fine. There's the cult of kissing on both cheeks, whether you like the other person or not. There's the cult of smiling or laughing even when you're dying inside. There's all kinds of cult protocols, and this is our cult. Regardless of what's real, regardless of what you think, feel, and believe, etc., you do like this, or you do like that, you do like that, or you are arrested, your things are stolen from you, you're ostracized, you're humiliated, and if you do everything you're told and take these degrees, etc., then you'll be honored and given a high rank in the cult. And every culture has certain things that are cult-like, meaning at some point it's because that's who we are. Well, I don't feel like that. Well, because I said so. And so the system that we're all living in is not perfect by a long shot. And the system of any new community is not perfect by a long shot, particularly when it's wobbly and just getting started. And we're asking people to change their identities. I mean, when you go from being on the outside into a 10x community, your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is radically different. I mean, you're still using English. There's still gravity. You've still got the same body. But how you're spending your day, how you're working, how you're thinking, how you're resolving conflict, how you're moving through illness, how you're being born, how you're dying, how you're communicating, these are all different. And there's a certain amount of trust in self and others that's necessary to do that. And the traumatized person whose primary agenda is avoiding being out of control doesn't necessarily want to do that. So this is, how do we navigate a traumatized population fixated on an identity that is familiar, that is like family, that isn't healthy, that isn't optimal, it's familiar? How do you move that into and through the resistance? Well, there's a couple of steps. Number one, traumatic literacy. You and anyone else involved have got to read books like The Body Keeps the Score. You've got to understand that in order to transition from a less healthy pattern to a more healthy pattern, one must go through the hero's journey, the fear of death, the fear of the unknown. And you're going to need a certain amount of self-confidence and abundance to do that, which is why it's best that core members have independent resources within and without, logistical resources, emotional resources, financial resources, etc., so that if the community fails, and it is important to be humble to the fact that 90% of communities fail, and that 95% of all efforts to start new human relationships fail. You look at all the people who have made some impulse to try and get to know and get into a relationship with you. 95% of those are no longer in your life. If you look at all, the people you've ever encountered socially and made some effort for, 95% of those are not in your life in any meaningful way today. 95% of that falls by the wayside. And so these are humbling statistics. And, one approach would be to anticipate that perhaps 9 out of every person that, makes some effort towards the community will no longer be in the community in coming years. And it's important, I think, to understand what is and isn't wasted time around this. When you're gelling a new culture, it is very important to tend that garden and not be, drawn aside. And so that's one of the things that I'm focusing on. Now, another thing that's important to understand is that the reptilian brain is associated initially with trauma. Fight, flight, and freeze is the traumatic domain. And so anyone in a traumatized state that's entering new is going to enter through the reptilian brain. Can I dominate it? Do I have a way out of running? Because it's unknown. and because the primary underlying agenda is I never want to feel that way again. I never want to be victimized like that again. And so can I dominate it, or can I run away, or do I have some place safe to hide? Well, this is a transparent culture, and so there's no place to hide. And the app, magnifies that. So there will be a lot of, in a traumatically illiterate culture, dynamic on dominance and versus and running. How do we move through the reptilian brain in a traumatically illiterate culture? Well, that's where, both having some security and confidence outside, understanding that this is an adventure, and that it has tremendous upside potential, but it has statistical odds of failure. And so understanding that it requires more effort, not less, more skill, not less, more resources, not less, and a little bit of patience and attention to detail, and getting the code right is really important. One of the reasons that it's important to have people with some independent resources is, if someone's being evicted or is leaving their apartment and, they've got to come right now, you don't have time to read 20 books and understand the culture and have the nuance. You're moving things. And now that I'm here, I'm trapped, and I've got to defend my identity, my pattern. You can't tell me what to do. And so it's actually, I think, important for people to become mentally aware, and that's where I'm developing the proof of work module around kind of the community, so that you can kind of begin entering the culture mentally and emotionally long before you make a commitment. And so have more of a gentle transition. Maybe you do, read a variety of books and come and do a work party. Understanding the fragility of something getting off, it's very important, meaning my discipline will be to cut out anyone that bleeds energy away from things that need to be done, whether it's planting trees or building homes, etc. The community does not need to have, philosophical discussions early on about this and that and the other from people who haven't invested any money, done the proof of work or showed up. But as long as there's a strong net positive, that someone's investing in the venture 2/3 for every 1/3 that they may take, because there has to be, a flow, then that's fine. Having philosophical discussions while planting trees and creating permaculture and all that is just fine. But I think it's important to understand that in the emergence and kind of the community is going to go through the different brain levels. So we're going to start with the reptilian, which is a fear-based brain. At that level, there will be an authoritarian. So you have an alpha needs to be involved as long as the reptilian brain is in charge. And there's safety in an alpha position. And just by default, in the sense that, a lot of the structure and experience and money and time, going into this is going to be coming from me. I'll be operating in an alpha position as the logistics come together, and just drawing lines where energy is being bled out from those ventures. And I have the competency to design intelligent logistics. That just, it's always come relatively easy for me. And I have the money to do that, and a sense of management from running a business for 29 years in the construction fields. And so it'll start out, somewhat in that reptilian brain, in a dominance hierarchy. Now, part of the problem is nobody has seen this new culture, and we are culturally illiterate to a large extent, meaning most of us have never done a conscious mental analysis of our cult relative to all the other cults that have existed in human history, and kind of compared, like, what's the return on investment in Denmark in time, dollars, and resources per unit of happiness? How about in Finland? What is happiness? And how does that compare with the US return on investment, or with this other group? And because we've somewhat self-referentially put a lot of focus on quality of architecture, et cetera. But if you spend time in different cultures, you'll find that a number of people with very low architectural aesthetic, or small houses that are relatively simple, are much less stressed and much more relaxed, social, and welcoming. In other words, they have far higher levels of both security and love and belonging, and feel pretty good about themselves, and are not apologizing for having feelings. Those are not showing up in our metrics. And so, there's going to have to be some proof of work and involved before the mind can start evaluating the new culture relative to the old culture. And one of the things that will help with that is, objective data. But it's also important to understand that one of the biggest friction points will be, on the one hand, like, I've never met anyone in the world that has designed a culture or has been passionately interested, in spending time with 100 female lovers on multiple continents. Not one of them has shown a strong interest in personal relationship design, in the culture of two people as a recipe. That's always been my domain. And, the women with the confidence and the curiosity and the analytical ability have said, oh, that's a great design, let's try that. And there's been a tremendous explosion in well-being, in intelligence, in growth. But a lot of people, it's just enough to say that's different. And we have a dirty word for that. It's called weird, meaning it diverges from the norm. And we don't have the intelligence to determine whether the divergence is towards intelligence or towards, Luddite stupidity. In other words, you have the average, mediocrity, and then you have two divergences from the norm. And one is leading towards something incredible, and the other is leading towards something worse than average. But you need intelligence and confidence to decide with each point in each situation, as it diverges from the norm, is it bringing more well-being per unit of energy invested or less relative to the mean, relative to the average? So if you don't have that ability, then it's just different and change. And then it falls back into the adolescent, because we do not initiate people into adulthood. Every teenager has a primary thing of nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm in rebellion. And so you try and give a very different structure to a group of psychological adolescents, and passive aggressively or actively aggressive, it's a big power battle. And it's just a reality that the community cannot work with that level and cannot get started with that level of consciousness. Now, I'm just as adolescent as the next person, but I have given a lot of thought to the structures and watched them in my personal relationships to see which structures have borne fruit, and whether it's in reading hundreds of books or taking dozens upon dozens of workshops or spending time at successful communities such as the Findhorn community, and really looking at structures that work and why, and observing. As a designer, I do have a strong competency in there, and it's not going to be perfect, but my plan is to just move things to the state where they appear to have the best odds of success. And at that stage, just to filter out, people that see it differently, please start, do a venture on your own. You absolutely do not have to see any of this my way, by all means. If your current life or something that you can do elsewhere, is more suited to you, then do it. And so, I've got to create this in the way that I can see and understand, both analytically from past experience, have the competency and funds to pull off. Once it gets in place through that kind of more autocratic reptilian brain mode of, boss employee type thing, and, which works. I mean, I've hired hundreds of staff over the years, and both myself and them, have all kinds of traumatic histories and stuff. And, as long as you follow the structure, a lot of things can happen. You don't have to be traumatically literate. But for core people beginning to form and move through into the mental and the empathic brains, once many of the structures are laid out and there are some experiential workshops, then you have the ability to do mental analysis, meaning nobody should participate if they analyze and find that their well-being is decreasing and they expect that to continue. Now, here again, we have a bumpy ride, and here's what I mean. I don't like jogging, and I can assure you that if I go out jogging, as out of shape as I am physically, that I'm not going to feel better on the first day, and I'm not going to feel better on the second day. I'm not going to necessarily feel better on the third day. And I can also say that if at any point in the process I say, do I rather lay in bed or go out jogging, I'd much rather lay in bed. That doesn't necessarily mean that overall my well-being will increase if I don't do any aerobic exercise and lay in bed more. Quite the opposite. And so this is a difficult thing, to figure out and sort out. So there are a number of processes that have a learning curve. Now, what I can tell you is that I've gone through these learning curves with romantic relationships because, as I've said, I've never met the woman who had a design for the relationship that was well thought out and articulated, and so we did that. Instead, there's women that are open or attracted, and so I say, well, why don't we funnel that attraction in this way or this way, because it's got good odds. Let's not do the average because that has very bad odds. Let's do this because 85% of the time it produces more value. And so for confident, mature women who enjoy growing, this is very exciting and great things happen. For other people, this is, terrifying and they run off. And so that's, but there is a learning curve of practicing speaking this way, learning that in this culture, you don't get punished for saying this. Because if your body tells you you're going to die because you're saying a secret, because that was the message in your family, so you have the familiar feeling, I'm going to die. Well, it's going to feel horrible, like this community isn't for me, right? But if you tell the same thing and are celebrated and honored, and then people respect, meaning they see you more, and so they work around what they see more intelligently. Now you feel seen in a way you've never have. And so the payoff, unexpected, is much higher. The punishment, expected memory in the body doesn't happen. And it takes some time. And that's why I think that, that's why I'm making these videos and stuff. I think that everyone deserves to understand this framework more mentally and conceptually and become literate in these areas so that we're going through these stages as more of a partner, so that we recognize the fight, flight, freeze reptile in one or both of us and can, have a common language to explore what's going on and why. At the point when the community is somewhat functioning, then you can have the analytical brain kick in and say, this is working well for me, not so much here, or I can make an assessment that I'm enjoying myself here and that this is costing less money and it's less stressful, but it's less stressful by 30% for me, and it's costing less money by 70% for me than the alternative. And I like this, etc. Now the analytical brain can take hold, but you need an experiential context before the analytical brain can take hold. And it's, my view is all systems are flawed. Nobody knows the system of this particular culture. And there's the strong fear of the unknown that has to be pushed through to a certain extent with discipline, or you have to become highly traumatically literate and do some of that healing so that you're excited by the unknown and adventure. And then you have to get good, because if you're doing a dance that you've never done before, you're used to this dance, right? And you do it really well because you've done it your whole life. But it's not a very interesting dance. And you want to learn, this dance, also not very interesting, but let's say there's a few more moves in there. And so you want to learn that. And the first thing is discomfort, uncertainty. How does it feel? And now you're thinking it. You're not really, you got to practice it. You got to practice the new shape until it becomes second nature. Only then can you evaluate whether you would go back to the other way, because you still remember that. If you rode a tricycle and now you've graduated to a bicycle, you still remember the tricycle, and any of us could get on a small tricycle and move around. But we've seen the potential for speed, for better shock absorption, for better view, for better stretching of the muscles. And so most of us will never go back to a tricycle. But you had to fall over a little bit on the bike. You had to try this, you had to try that, you had to do this. And there's more danger because it's new, because you're higher, because you're going faster. But once you get the hang of it, you never go back. And so that's the threshold to reach through. Now, we all can see, that clearly for a bicycle, and we know what the advantage is. But for something that's unknown, a culture in for a group of people that is culturally illiterate, meaning it would be wonderful if all of us spent an hour a week breaking down our culture block by block, looking at how much energy went into the culture in this element, and how much well-being comes out the other side, and how much stress and irritation, how much waste is there, and then what would be a 10 times better design. Now, if we all did that from, kindergarten on, first of all, we'd all be culturally literate, meaning we wouldn't be in the water, swimming in it with blinders on. We would be evaluating and analyzing each step of the way. And we would be highly dissatisfied with the present culture and very excited about any number of new iterative designs that we can easily see. But that's a talent that needs practice. So that's been my discipline and practice, over the last 20 years, is modular by modular, module by module, whether it was with my own education or with romantic relationships or the structure of business or the structure of advertising or whatever it is. How can we make this much more intelligent? Structure of gardens, structure of houses, structure of communicating with clients. All these different things are design elements. And so this is just taking that to a next level. Now, once the brain is on board, I know how to do this. I'm over my fear of the unknown because it's now known, right? And so it's a hero's journey to get to that point. And the people for whom it's not a good fit have left, and the people for whom it's a fit are there. Now we're moving into the terrain of the empathic brain, where we, through time and ritual, become intimate, become more attuned and responsive to one another. And that's why the group is small. Your brain can only do that with up to 150 people. And so this is the fruit. This is where it gets juicy. The first bits, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, are a big, stressful irritant, which, I would love to be able to, arrive at this community that I've never seen and just, be there rather than be the focal point, particularly since it needs to go through a somewhat autocratic phase to, get to that point. But the empathic brain is by far the most exciting. It's the human brain, and it's the areas where a culture like this can make the biggest difference from a normal culture. And at a certain level of abundance, physical, emotional, sexual, logistical, financial, at a certain point in abundance, the community can start peeking through into transcendence, which is the state of ecstasy, ecstasis. But in order to do that, you need a very high level of competency, or it becomes, highly volatile and traumatizing. So you need a competency to create and sustain those states, and now we're talking about, the most transcendent, beautiful gifts imaginable. This is what we're all yearning for. This is what we're all starving for, is the separation from our own transcendent brain and its ability to see our interconnectedness with all things. Now, evolution has prioritized survival, security of survival, love and belonging, self-esteem, developing competencies, creating wealth with those competencies, and then becoming part of something bigger than ourselves. In other words, we're moving through the very last step. The flowering of our humanity is in the transcendent brain. So we'll be moving through the brains, basically, and very consciously. It's going to be incredibly exciting and growth-oriented.